Okay, so in a post to the community forum, I talked about this doc for tracking health. I posted this to the community forum, and I mentioned a performance issue with calculating potassium to sodium for the day. So this column right here. Now, if you look at the actual view in the doc that I demonstrate, there's all these different columns for different values, macros that I'm tracking. But for the purposes of this explanation, I have a simplified view, which just has the potassium, the sodium, which are the values we're concerned with. And then we want to calculate potassium to sodium ratio for things like for a given meal and for a given day. So, all right, for any given, all right, and so in this view, just to summarize what we have here, um, if we collapse the group entirely, so these are just values for entire days. So this is the sodium for the day, this is potassium for the day. If we expand it, we'll see, you can see this is a meal, this set of food items, and it was at this time, and then here's another couple at this time, et cetera, et cetera. So for any given food item, to get the potassium to sodium ratio, that's this number right here. That's very simple. That's just, we have the potassium value divided by the sodium value. I mean, if you look at this, the formula is literally that simple. It's just, here we go, edit formula. There it is, potassium divided by sodium. Okay, but you might care about, for example, the potassium sodium ratio for a given meal or for a given day. Now, I already calculate potassium and sodium ratio for the day. That's right here. And I'll get into that formula in a second. But let's say, okay, so we have this naive calculation of potassium to sodium. If we wanted to have, let's say for a given meal, the ratio, let's say we want to have that show up right here. I mean, it's the group view, right? So we want the kind of the summary value to show up here. Well, that's the number that we want to show up here is essentially the potassium for the meal, so with the sum of these values, divided by the sodium for the meal, which is the sum of these values. We want that to appear here. Now, the sum of these values, sum of the potassium for the meal, that shows up right here. That's very simple. We just have the function sum selected, right? Similar for the sodium. The sum of the sodiums for the meal shows up right here. And that, again, that's just, you pick the function sum from the summary functions. But in order to get the potassium to sodium ratio for the meal, there's no function here that you can really pick to get that number. As far as I know, I don't think any of these apply. Because as I just said, you want the sum of these values divided by the sum of these values. So really what you want to provide here is, I mean, for any individual row, it's just the sum of this value divided by the sum of that value. For the group, it's the sum of these values divided by the sum of this value. So it's almost as if we need an additional function to specify here, which is like a formula applied to the group. So in pseudocode, maybe that formula would look something like this. Let's say that you take the group and then you say take the potassium values for that. That's a set of values, right? And then you say sum of those values divided by, and then the same thing for the sodium. You take the group, you take the sodium values for that, and then the sum of those values, right? So it's the sum of the potassium for the group divided by the sum of the sodium of the group. Maybe an alternative syntax would be something like this, where you say group.potassium.sum divided by group.sodium.sum, right? So something like that would be nice to be able to specify right here. As you can see, I do have an entire row for calculating, entire column for potassium to sodium ratio for the day. It's kind of awkward, right? Because, I mean, it's the same value for every item in that day. So I think it'd be more natural to just populate it here. And if you look at what goes, so in my post, in one of my posts, I talk about why this column values, or these column values are expensive to calculate. If you look at the formula of what goes into potassium sodium ratio for the day, that's actually quite simple. It's just potassium for the day divided by the sodium for the day. However, let's take a look at what goes into, for example, just this number, potassium for the day. And I have that shown right here as a column. Let's look at that formula. This is the expensive one. As you can see, for every single row in the view here, we're taking the table and we're filtering the rows. We're asking for the rows whose date is equal to the current row's date. So now we have a set of rows, and then we're taking that set of rows and saying, give me the potassium. So now it's a set of values, and then we're taking the sum of that set of values. That's how we get that. Now, and we're doing that expensive, computationally expensive calculation for every cell here for potassium for the day. We're also doing it for sodium for the day, and then we divide those two, and that's how you get this one. I also have similar columns for potassium for a given meal, and then sodium for a meal. So yeah, so two things here. Number one, I mean, kind of a feature request, I guess, to have be able to specify formulas for groups here. And then number two, if anybody knows of a more efficient way to do what I'm doing now in the doc, that would be, yeah, any suggestions along those lines are welcome. Just a faster way to calculate this column. So yeah, thank you for listening. All right, bye-bye.